All right, we're live.
3, 2, 1. Caleb.
Sorry, I know that's my fault. I lost the PDF that I was going to read off of. I'm so sorry.
All you're going to say, it's okay. This is what this is all about. The live video is always crazy. Is the intro. This is Literary Roadhouse.
Okay.
One short story.
Okay. Sorry about that. Here it comes, I promise. All right, I'll be quiet, and then I'll say it. This is Literary Roadhouse. Oh, wait, sorry. Did you say action? Already, this is stellar. I'm really glad I could join the fray here and help out this.
Hey, dude, you so fit in. You so fit in.
I'm doing it for real now this time. Okay. This is Literary Roadhouse. One short story, once a week. I'm Caleb.
I'm Maya.
And I'm Anais.
Is that me?
Yeah, that's you. You introduced Caleb.
I'm like looking at my script and it's got all these cross outs and I can't read. Okay, can we start from the top? I'm sorry. Stop laughing and we haven't even started. This is no good. This episode's going to go downhill real quick, isn't it?
That's what I bring to the discussion and most of the time, so I'll try.
Okay, breathe.
All right. Okay. This is Literary Roadhouse. One short story, once a week. I'm Caleb.
I'm Maya.
And I'm Anais.
And on today's episode, we will be discussing Axolotl by Julio Cortázar. And we also have a special guest since Gerald is still in his RV touring the UK. Welcome, Caleb J. Ross. He is an author and podcaster, and I've been following him for quite a bit. I think he will be a great addition to today's episode. Say hello to everybody.
Hello, everybody. I'm very, very excited to be here. I've been listening for a while, and I hope I can contribute something of value to this podcast, but I'm not promising anything right away.
Okay. That's why you're here.
I'm being honest.
So, why don't you tell people a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I'm as Maya said, I am a podcaster at the Important Question podcast. It's a short podcast, usually 15 to 20 minutes or so, where myself and friend Gordon Hyland just talk about, and also fellow author as well, just kind of discuss a random question for a little while, usually to humorous effect. So nothing quite serious, but sometimes it gets a little serious. Examples of the questions would be like, would you jump off a bridge if all your friends were doing it? Those typical mom-type questions or whatever, and we really kind of dive into the psychology of what would cause someone to do that or not do that if all of their friends were. So it gets a little heady at times, but it's a lot of fun. And I am a recovering fiction author. I do have a few books out there. Look me up, Caleb J. Ross, on all of these social profiles and stuff. I think you might like, I don't know every single audience member out there, obviously, but you may enjoy the work, so check it out, definitely.
Which brings up a great segue. Could not have had a better segue, Caleb, because your podcast is not safe for little people.
That's true. That's true. That is a very important caveat, yes.
So I should let everybody know that this episode most likely will be explicit. I know normally I tell people we're rated PG-13, but I know him and I know us. So we will be rating each individual episode, and due to Anais's amazing foresight last week, I'm also putting the show ratings in the actual show notes because I did not realize that the iTunes ratings does not show on a lot of the podcatchers. So now you'll be able to look and figure out whether the episode is safe for your children to listen to, whether you're using iTunes or not. And on that note, thank you, Anais, for that. That was a really great tip. So today's episode, as I already said, we're going to be talking about Axolotl. This is an Argentinian story, am I correct?
Argentina.
Was Julio from Argentina? Yeah. Julio was from Argentina, and the axolotl is a type of salamander that is very distinct in that it never completely finishes its metamorphosis, and so instead of becoming a land living animal, it stays in the water and it just sits kind of incomplete in a larva stage. And this whole story really is about a young man who is obsessed with the animal in, I guess it's a zoo or some sort of like museum for animals, and he becomes obsessed with the axolotls, and he begins going to their area every single day and staring in the aquarium until eventually he becomes one of them. And so, let's get started.
Right away, I have to say I'm very impressed that you were able to summarize that story, given that closing quote by Jorge Luis Borges at the end, where he explicitly said, if we try to summarize these stories, we lose something in them. So congrats on that, first of all.
I didn't say I summarized it well. So, how did everybody feel about the story, just off the top? Did you like it? Did you not like it? Who wants to go first?
I can go first. So I did like it. I liked it quite a bit. I found it funny, even though it's kind of depressing as well. So it's funny depressing, which is the best way to handle kind of dark, lonely, depressive type stuff. And I also thought that the imagery was very well done, so I'm excited to get into that.
I think it was. I'm a huge fan of magical realism, and I know on this podcast there's definitely a divide between those who enjoy it and those who don't. I'm definitely of the enjoy it camp, and I'm just a huge fan of magical realism in general, especially its roots, its Latin roots. So I really like the story. It's short enough that I don't feel as though I have lost something or that I was gypped in a way, because there isn't really a narrative, so to speak. It's more of a sort of an event that happens, or an elongated event, but there's no real, true narrative, I don't think. So yeah, that's just to say that I really did enjoy it. I'm already rambling.
I loved it too, which makes this is going to be interesting, because I loved it, but I didn't see it as a short story. I saw it almost as a prose poem, or almost a non-musical song. Like, that doesn't even make sense, but that's just the texture I got from it. I do like some magical realism, but a lot of it I haven't really been that exposed to. As I read this, I can see how it's classified as magical realism, but it didn't feel like magical realism to me. It just felt like my reality. But I guess that's because I'm crazy. So yes, I loved it. I can see how it could be depressing, though, for some people. Though I'm not sure I had the same reaction. So, Anais, why don't we start off with just, what did you like about it? What didn't you? Well, why don't we just start with what you liked about it?
Well, I think I liked a lot of things about it, but there's sort of like two categories that really impressed me. One is before the metamorphosis actually takes place, the clues that Cortázar weaves into the story as to why he's so attracted to them, even though he seems to be focusing on the physical aspect of it, he throws in all these tiny sort of clues, like the fact that their immobility makes it seem as time feels like it's less if we stay quietly, or he talks about how they have another way of seeing, or that with their indifferent mobility they abolish space and time. Like, all these tiny sentences amongst these really elaborate descriptions of a really strange creature was really impressive. And the way he passed between them to we whenever he did it. When he's talking about how they look, it's them. And when he talks about how they feel and how he sort of projects the way that he feels onto them, now it's we, which I thought was really clever.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the second thing is just the imagery. I just recently read Bird by Bird by Anne Lamott, and she talks about the 1-inch picture frame, like when you want to describe something, picture just an inch of it. And he went over these tiny creatures sort of inch by inch, and it was really well done. I could picture it, even though I'm not intimately familiar with them. Sure, Google image search helps.
How about you, Caleb?
I have to echo a lot of what Inez said. I think it was amazing to me the slow metamorphosis of the story. So when you think of a metamorphosis story, generally speaking, the story itself, and I'll compare it, I guess, in that sense to the Metamorphosis by Kafka. The metamorphosis happens, and the story is what happens as a result of that metamorphosis. But here we're actually seeing the slow transition. And what's interesting is that the transition, you don't really know until the end, and even at the end, you're not really sure. And this is, I think, why it fits into the realm of magical realism, whether it's a literal transformation or not. I mean, the assumption is that yes, a lot of the we language, of course. At the very beginning, I think it's the first paragraph, the end of the first paragraph, it ends, "Now I am an axolotl," which you would think, you think that's probably just a metaphor. That can't be literal, right? Because a lot of people say, "I am this," and they're not actually a thing. Plus, he's still a kid. I think it was a young boy, if I remember correctly, moving, throughout his day. So obviously, he's not literally this salamander. But as it slowly moves, he drops a few hints. He talks about we. He transposes himself and talks about himself from the perspective of these salamanders. So, and it's not until the very end when there is that as literal transformation as you can possibly get, that you kind of realize something magical did in fact happen there. And there's a lot of, I counted up, I think, 8 or 9 different instances where he refers to himself as one of these salamanders without yet literally saying that he is that salamander. So that's very poetic, and I really enjoyed that.
Yeah, I think that's why, as I was reading it, it felt so much like poetry. As Annie said, the choice in sentences and language was so specific and precise. And I think this is something that I lean to as I'm starting to read deeper. I'm noticing that certain writers, like literally every sentence is so perfectly constructed. It's almost as if each sentence has its own arc. And the sentences, there were certain sentences that as I read them, they were just like, wow. There was a complete thought there, and it was entirely captured. And whereas when I write, a lot of times I'll write something, and I'm like, that's not what I mean. Try it again. But as I was reading it, there was no sense that anything was missing, even though it was such a short story. There was no sense that anything was extra. It was this pure experience. And the other thing that I appreciated the most is this description of dissociation. And I think this is something that most people have experienced on some level, but especially as children, when you have like really strong, when you're like really into your imagination and you're playing, and all of a sudden you stop being you for that moment, whether you're playing cowboys and Indians or Huckleberry Finn or whatever you're doing. For a split second, you're no longer you, and it's the same feeling you have if you're running and all of a sudden you forget that you're running. Like, there was that sense as I was reading it, and it was such a perfect encapsulation of that. And that experience is something I've been trying to get on paper, and I've read so many stories where other people tried to describe it and they couldn't get it. But the way he moved between them and we, and the way the language just was so fluid, it was like so perfect to me. I think that was the thing I loved most about it, was that he was able to capture that diffused sense of self in a way that I haven't seen done before.
And it's interesting that you say that, because remember, we're reading a translation. And we've talked before about the important work that translators do, if he's able to capture that, especially because Spanish is very musical and very sort of fluid. So that was captured even in English.
And I've always wondered that, and that's an interesting perspective, because I don't speak Spanish very well at all. I'm definitely trying, but it's sort of a dream of mine to one day eventually be able to read Borges like in the native tongue, and I haven't been able to do that yet. But it's really, I've always, as an English reader, I've always wondered what is the translation, what is the actual voice of the author, because I love so much of this magical realism, which the vast majority of it, especially the I guess I would call it the pure magical realism, is natively written in Spanish. So I always wondered if it's the author doing it, or if it's the translator doing it, or if it's a perfect combination of the two. I don't think I'll ever really get to know that, but I've also noticed that even writers of magical realism who are not natively Spanish speaking, one of the more contemporary examples would be Amy Bender. She does a lot of that kind of stuff, and she's very much a contemporary American author, but she borrows from a lot of these traditions. Even her language is very, very almost scientifically detached in a lot of ways. My favorite author of all time is Brian Evanson, and his work is also very much the same way. He's very specific in the words that he uses, and I think it might have to do with, and this is me putting on the author hat and me assuming also that it might have to do with the understanding that the material itself is so difficult to grasp, consciously so. It's not really supposed to be something you can grasp, that if they were to not use specific language, then the reader might be even further put off. You know, it's a topic I can't quite grasp, the imagery I can't quite grasp, and then also layer on the language itself that I can't quite grasp, and that might be a little too confusing. So if you have to purposely be very, very specific, more so with a magical realist story than you might with any other genre of writing, I would assume. So that's my assumption. I'm not sure how much that holds together.
In another way, you have more room to fall, so you end up paying more attention.
Much more succinct, yes. Much more succinct. Very good.
I find that a lot of current authors, you know, they're so pushed out more and more that some of the authors that I find that have the most specific language are actually poets that turn around and then try to write a novel. You know, they stumble all over the place trying to get a hold of plot and character, but they're very precise in their language, and it's something that I do appreciate.
Mm-hmm.
Annie,
I kind
did
of want
you
to go back.
read the story in Spanish, or did you only read it in English?
I read it in English. I was gonna try to find it in Spanish for free, but I didn't. I didn't look too hard though, because I was traveling. But I was gonna go back to the magical realism point, because I feel like the choice to call this magical realism or surrealism really depends on whether or not you think that the transformation was very literal. Because at the end, he still sees himself visiting the tank from the perspective of the salamander. You can almost think like whether it's literal or not doesn't matter, whether or not he actually became physically a salamander, in which case it would be more like magical realism. But if you believe he really did become a salamander, then it's just surreal, isn't it? Like once you cross that sort of line, the realism goes right out the window.
Once you get to that point, you're really like starting to delve into what exactly is magical realism, which is a whole other ball of worms. We've already tried to define magical realism, and it's a moving target, you know. I think this story definitely, you know, you bring up a great point, Annie's, because I think there are a lot of surreal qualities. For me, as I was reading it, I don't really care whether he actually physically became a salamander or not, because that's not the end-all and be-all of my personal reality. But I recognize that that's just my worldview talking. For most people, they're going to, like if Gerald read the story, he would want to know whether or not that person really turned into a salamander or not. Because if it was a metaphor, then he'd like it. But if it's not a metaphor...
That's true. I think it's worth unpacking that a little bit too, because I mean that's a great point that Anise made up. That Anise said that was, it could be in the eye of the beholder. And I think one of the tenets of magical realism, at least as my professors back in college would state it, was that if there's a magical element and the people in the story don't view it as a magical element, they view it kind of as everyday life, then it kind of leans more toward the magical realism. You know, I know you guys discussed some. Gabriel Garcia Marquez, I can't remember which story it was. The handsomest dead man in the world, I think it was. And then he also wrote one of his more famous ones too, is The Very Old Man with Enormous Wings, and those are two stories where no one really thinks of what's happening as that strange. Like The Handsomest Dead Man in the World, for example, very few of the characters. It's been a while since I've read that story, but few of the characters even really are surprised that he's dead so much. They're really just they talk about his life and try to intuit his life. Same thing with The Very Old Man with Enormous Wings. They comment on his wings, but they're not really surprised that this guy has wings. That's not really the element to it. So I think in this story, if you do think of the literal transformation, you almost have to even then, and I'm sort of going back on the whole magical realism thing, but even then, I think you would have to have that in some sort of context in order for it to really be considered magical realism. You'd have to have some other person, and I think in the story there might have been a security guard, if I remember correctly, or something that kind of looks at him, makes fun of him a little bit, but I don't know if that's enough context to really make it into really officially call it magical realism rather than just sort of a surreal story. And you know, even further on that, I don't know that. I wanted to believe that it was a literal transformation just because that's more fun for me. But I think if it was, that almost discredits the entire preceding story, because the preceding story was about the slow build, about empathizing with something that's not only not you as a person, but it's a completely different species, and you're sort of seeing yourself in that. if there is a literal transformation at that, it almost removes all the sort of connectedness that you were building up to begin with. You almost kind of want it to stay a metaphorical transformation, or at least for me. So I'm talking myself in circles here, but I think that's good. That's the point of discussing a story, I think.
Yeah, honestly, I was talking myself into very similar circles. Whether or not the transformation is real, I will say that for me the mood was definitely a very surreal mood. As I was reading it, I had the same emotions that I would have if I was standing in front of a surrealist painting. And one of the things that we've talked about, as you said, about translations, I don't speak Spanish, but I grew up surrounded by Spanish. And there was a tone to the translation that felt very familiar, and it felt very very Spanish, like, quite frankly. And that's one of the reasons why I was curious if any of you had read it in Spanish, because I have a feeling that this is probably a really good translation. It had that tone to it. It had a musicality to it. There was just something about the way the sentences were constructed and the word order that just spoke to me of a very Spanish feel, kind of how, if I read a Japanese story, even though I don't speak Japanese, I go to a Japanese temple and I listen to a lot of people speaking Japanese, and I can kind of tell if the tone is right, or if the language is wide enough, if it's all-encompassing enough, versus whether it's precise and staccato and very American in that way. And so, yeah, I'm very curious. I think sometimes with these stories, I think we probably should be looking up who the translators are and saying, hey, Julio Cortázar and so is the translator, because the translator has such a big part in this.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah. It's funny to hear you guys talk about the sort of circular logic and thinking about the metamorphosis or the circular mood. And the plot itself is circular because it starts with him already saying, I am an axolotl, and then he tells you how he got there. And at the end, when he is saying he's physically an axolotl because he feels one of the other ones touch him, one of the little pink hands. Then he's looking out at the human who used to be him, his body, and he says, oh, he's coming less often. I hope at least one day he writes a story about us. And then you get back to the beginning because
that's right. Yeah, oh, you're right.
Exactly.
I love that.
Yeah.
I love that.
I love it too.
Like, by virtue of the existence of the story, the human's not completely gone because somebody had to write the story, which was the human. That's what was hinted at the end. So it's like, are you in both now? Because I kept wondering, I'm like, is there now an axolotl brain in the human body? But it wouldn't matter because all the axolotls have human brains, apparently.
Did you guys take a look at that little creature? It does kind of look creepy, kind of human with its little fingers and then the weird things coming up from its ears.
It does.
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting looking creature.
And I wanted to ask both of you this: does being able to see an image of the creature take anything away from the story? I mean, when the story was written, you couldn't just Google the creature and find out what it looks like. You'd actually have to probably go to a library and hope they have a book about it. But does seeing what the creature looked like before you read the story, does that take anything away from it or do anything at all?
Added to it. I mean, if you think about it, this story was written in Argentina, and back then people were still eating them, so it wasn't like an animal people weren't familiar with. Now, once the story got to our shores, it was a strange animal that we wouldn't have any clue. But where the story was originally from, the animal was probably a lot more familiar. And I think
that makes it creepier to me, right?
Huh?
That makes it even creepier, right? If it was a familiar, it'd be this, it's a very familiar animal that he's basically, you eat, so to speak, and he's empathizing with it and becoming that.
And you see it in the zoo, and
I was going to say, I'd take the opposite position. I think knowing what it looks like does detract a little bit from the story because now you're not sort of bringing... You know how the picture in the story we read doesn't show the tail? So I read the story before looking up additional Google image searches, and the tail that I pictured in my head is completely different than the tail that came up in the Google image search. So the animal does change in the way you imagine it. It's kind of like when you read a book before you watch the movie and you picture Harry Potter a certain way, and then after you watch the movie, forever it's Daniel Radcliffe. That's kind of what happens.
I think it depends on whether or not you think the actual creature is better than your imaginary creature. My imagination wasn't that great. That creature was creepy.
Yeah, it is creepy. But the other thing is he kept describing the eyes as gold, and all the Google image search pictures had black eyes. So every time I read it as gold, and I get it, Aztec gold, there's like this whole Aztec thing going on. There's Aztec mythos, which I looked up, which I can explain in a minute. But like, I'm like, where's the gold eyes? I can't find a single picture of this salamander with gold eyes, and it like bugged me every time because I knew what it looked like. And if I didn't know what it looked like, I'd be like, gold eyes.
Camera flashes.
Maybe.
I was like, oh, they're just because he wasn't looking at a camera.
Yeah.
Could be that the light from the camera messed it up, or isn't capturing this amazing gold that goes into the infinite.
I'd say I'm probably with you, Anise, that I feel something was removed from seeing it first, because if you look at the first introduction of the creature, the entire description, the first part of the description isn't even physical. It's just about the animal's habits and about these things. So it actually doesn't even get physical until I think it was like 3 or 4 paragraphs in.
Yeah.
And even then, it was described in such a way that it wasn't scientific. There were no measurements. The arms are this long, the fingers are this long. It was all described in relation in a very poetic way, and also in comparison to human characteristics and human traits. So if you had no experience with this animal and you didn't know what it was, you would assume he was looking at something that was very, very, very human-like almost, because that's the whole point of the story. Is he's insisting on the humanity of this creature. Having seen it, you know that's not the case. It's not a literal image of a human, a tiny human inside of an aquarium. So I think it takes a little bit away from it, but I don't know that it's definitely not enough for me to discount the story at all. So.
Yeah, see, for me, the picture of the creature, I didn't go searching Google Images to find extra pictures. I just saw the picture that was above the story that we attached to the website. And that picture, to me, when I first saw it, what creeped me out was how human it actually looked. I thought it looked like a mermaid without a tail. Without, like, the big mermaid fin. Because its hands looked so human, and it just seemed to be staring at me. And I was like, ooh, creepy. And so I think, because that was my initial response, was to just stare at it and think it looked a little human, kind of like a mermaid. Whereas he was talking about those aspects, I understood it, and so it didn't really take it away. I think possibly if I had gone out and looked for extra pictures that maybe weren't as fantastic looking, maybe I wouldn't have been so enthused. I like that picture.
Yeah, and so I also just sort of looked into the Aztec side of this a little bit, and there's apparently an Aztec myth where the twin brother of Quetzalcoatl, who is named Xolotl, so basically without the A, is the god of the underworld who experiences rebirth after going through a larval form. Like, oh, how cute.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if that's what the little animal was named after.
Mm.
I wonder too. Probably that would make sense. Yeah,
That's really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So, what do you guys actually think the story's about? Like we know what the story's about, but really, what is the story about?
I was trying to dig into it. The author, according to the very brief bio at the beginning of the story, or maybe it was at the end of the story. Either way, it doesn't matter. There was a mention about how he became very politically aligned later in his life, unlike Borges, who they compare to a lot in here. And so I was trying to see if there was some sort of political spin to put on it. But I think it's one of those stories that's very malleable, and there's a lot you can sort of make it represent really anything you want to. At its core, it's really a very simple story about transformation, about empathy, about seeing yourself as someone else, so much so that you become that other person. And again, that could have political overtones. I think that can be applied to, and I don't know nearly enough about the political region or the time that the story was written in, so I'm not going to even try. But you can apply that to really anything. It's just about empathy, about understanding someone else, about wanting to be someone else. It could even go that far. It could be about you could even stretch it and say it's about colonialism. I'm going to overtake your aquarium and force you to be me. You can do anything you want with it, and so it's very broad. I think very malleable. So I don't know that I have a hard time trying to divine a single truth behind what the author actually intended. And to be honest, I don't know that the author was necessarily meaning to say any particular thing. That's my take on it.
How about you,
Yeah,
Annie's?
for me, I noticed there was a lot going on about loneliness and imprisonment. So not only are they in an aquarium, they're in an aquarium behind iron bars, which just seems ridiculous. And they're kind of trapped in their little bodies that hardly ever move. They're completely immobile. And he feels a connection to them that he doesn't even feel with other people. The only other human is the guard who does not understand him. And then when he finally does the transformation and he's in the aquarium, remember the only surprise he's not surprised he's in Axolotl. That he assumed that was going to happen. There wasn't even like a big like wazam, like he just was. And then and he's like, the only surprise is that I still had a human mind. And then he started freaking out that he's like, am I trapped in this body with a human mind? Until another axolotl touches him and they make eye contact. And then he's like, oh no, we're all like this. This is great. So it's like he feels a connection with the other ones. And that's kind of like when the loneliness is abolished and he feels safe, even though he's still immobile and axolotl and in a tank. Just knowing that all the other axolotls also have human-like minds brings him peace. So I think that's definitely a theme that's there, which I think is kind of like existential. It's like he's just freaking out because he's completely alone in this terrifying world.
Yeah, I think that's why he was so open to the axolotls. Because remember, in the beginning of the story, before he becomes obsessed with them, he's talking about these other animals, and he's using words like his, mine, so he's already been obsessed with these animals for a while, which to me does speak of loneliness, of a great loneliness. He's going there for comfort. And then, as you say, there's so much about imprisonment in this story. I also saw a lot about just the universality of humanity and everybody feeling lonely and everybody feeling like they're, experiencing this by themselves, both individually as people, but then also individually as species. And so we're having this human experience, but we don't know if the dogs are having a similar experience or if the cougars are having a similar experience. And when you look in their eyes, sometimes they can seem so human. And so to me, there was a lot of that in there as well. It's one of the things I liked about the story was that it really was emotional for me as I read it, both because of the feeling of lack of breath, which probably comes from the constant reference to imprisonment. As I was reading it, there were certain points where I found my breath like heavy, and then also this really, really open feeling of, everything is all one, which was really interesting. As far as catching that in such a short story, entire books are written on that, and it doesn't capture it as well. Was there anything you guys didn't like about the story? Everyone's thinking.
Wow, yeah.
I don't know how to explain it. There was one section where I was like, this has gone a little too long. It's just after he does the complete metamorphosis and he feels peace when he's touched by another salamander's creepy little pink hand. But then he like starts to over-explain what he's already established a little bit, and all of a sudden the language, I had to read it a few times to understand it. But this feels like nitpicking at this point. Like there's one paragraph that wasn't absolutely perfect, and for all we know, it could have been lost in translation. Yeah.
How about you, Kenny?
It's very difficult. I'm usually against stories that try to hit you with a lot of, I guess, proving a lot of factual information up front, which this one is very factual heavy. So in the second paragraph, I think was basically it starts, I consulted a dictionary, and it follows a bunch of copy and paste information basically from a dictionary kind of thing. And those kind of stories usually put me off, and I think it's because I've read so many of them where, to me, it sounds like the author trying to prove their own knowledge and trying to leverage existing knowledge to make themselves sound really smart. Obviously, this story doesn't use it in that way. It's actually a necessary part of the story. So I will say that for people who may be in a hurry and get to that second paragraph and are already, kind of a bit taken away from it, I would say continue on, because I was originally maybe potentially put off by that, but luckily I did continue. So that's really about it. I just really liked everything about the story. I definitely am going to be reading more by this person because I frankly had never heard of him. So that's good for me, I guess.
Yeah, actually, I found a link in a PDF of an entire book of his short stories, and I will include that in last week's notes. I'll go ahead and just add that to last week's notes because I think the only link I included was this particular story. For me, it was similar to Annie's. I loved the story. The last paragraph, I was like, okay, get it over with. And it wasn't anything wrong with it. It's just, it felt like I got it, you know? And it was such an amazing ending when he transforms and then he's touched and there's this feeling of recognition. I was like, okay, we can end it there. I didn't necessarily feel like it was extra. I just kind of felt my attention drifting a little bit. But it was such a short period that it didn't really make that much of a difference for me.
Yeah.
Probably like a half
a question. I'm surprised that this hasn't come up because, so we're talking about the narrator. Is he crazy or is he rationally dealing with a terrifying part of being alive?
Is there a difference? I guess. I don't think he's crazy by any means because he seems too rational in his logic. I think it seems as though, and this is just looking at it from a pure language perspective. I mean, he has a scientific approach, yet he also has the ability to formulate sentences that are very sort of ethereal and out there. But it always seems within the right context. So just from that perspective alone, I think it'd be difficult to say he's crazy. And plus, there are people that are obsessed with animals. I mean, people make their living being obsessed with certain animals. So I think it's just a matter of being obsessed with something and finding, maybe he's just high. Maybe that's it, I guess.
For months on end.
For months on end,
I don't know. Because
Uh-oh.
Yeah, I think she's frozen. That's a good thing. Edit it later.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, it looks like it's either frozen or disconnected entirely. Maybe I can send her a quick chat.
No, she's
Wait.
gone. She'll be back.
Yeah.
I mean, I think like 4 people watch this. One of them is my mom. And at this point, if these things don't happen, they're disappointed because this is part of the tradition.
Oh.
Literary Roadhouse ritual.
Yeah, that's true. Because I generally listen to them rather than watch them. But I don't know if this is the case for all the episodes, but it looks as though it's sort of the audio is uploaded with an image on the website. Is that right for all of the episodes?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, yeah, that's what I thought. I didn't go all the way back to look at the rest of the videos, but so yeah. Well, that's good.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah, it's for the best, really.
Yeah, I can imagine. Doing these things live would be. I used to do a booktube. So booktube is just basically talking about books on YouTube. I used to do a bi-weekly hangout that lasted about an hour, and we just talk about book-related news, and it was live like this, and it was never as smooth as you'd like for it to be. What time is it? What time is it there where you are?
6:45.
Okay, cool.
So I'm an hour. I think I'm 2 hours behind you.
Yes.
This is perfect timing because the dog just started barking outside. This is great.
Well, and I was hoping you weren't able to hear it. My son was going to sleep, and sometimes that's not a good time for him. So he was whining a little bit. So I hope it didn't come through.
No, I didn't hear it.
That's good.
It's probably low enough that we can just sort of dampen it. Yeah. Well,
and they're all on. And you
started coughing through a lot of it.
And I guess because they're all in different tracks too, then it's pretty easy to cut out that part if it's which is a really smart thing to do. I used to. Oh, there she is. I used to do some recording, and I wouldn't have people on separate tracks, and that was awful.
Oh yeah, you gotta have everybody on separate tracks.
Yeah.
I don't know that. People are like, why do you do that? It's so much work. You can just rip the audio from Google Hangouts. Excuse me?
No way.
You couldn't pay me.
Because you've got people like me who blabber on and on and on, and you got to get rid of that. So
And you gotta like tone down my hyena laugh.
I'll just laugh harder to make it sound not so
I
funny.
hate my laugh on video. Whenever I listen to the recording, I'm like, why? I don't sound like that in my head.
I have a deeper voice in the recording. I'm like, damn. In my head.
Okay, where were we?
Is he crazy?
Is he crazy?
Oh, Anais, did you think he was nuts?
No, I didn't think he was nuts. I don't know. I kept going back and forth. There was a part of me that was like, a lot of people struggle with these things. Is the way that he handles it dysfunctional? Because isn't that kind of like how they define sort of mental disorders clinically? Like the range
Clinically, it's yeah. When we studied the DSM, it was a matter of everybody had. My teacher in first day class says, before you open your books, do not diagnose yourself because you are going to have every single symptom in this book. The difference is whether or not it's messing up your life. Whether it's causing problems at home, with your family, at work. Those are usually the clinical.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so then, Caleb was saying, well, he's so well-spoken, he's kind of self-aware, kind of. I mean, let's be real. He's like, well, it's not like I'm looking at a monkey. People look at monkeys and identify with them because they look like humans. This is a salamander. That's different.
True.
I'm like,
That's true.
Okay, narrator. Okay. There's a little bit of that going on. But is it dysfunctional? I mean, to the extent that he becomes a salamander, yeah. But in terms of like him coming to the zoo every single day for hours on end staring at these salamanders, if he has no responsibilities, I mean, I guess that's fine.
Well, maybe he didn't, but as he grows up and gets responsibilities, he stops coming so much.
Yeah,
so maybe
we don't know why he stops coming. It might just be that he had to go write this short story, and now we're back at the beginning.
If he is dysfunctional, though, isn't this story then just a voyeuristic story, and you really can't then look into it on a deeper level because now it's all of a sudden, what's the point? It was just a fun story. There's no way for us to necessarily relate to it. I'm speaking a little bit devil's advocate here, but in a way, is there a point?
I think calling him crazy makes it too easy to say, oh yeah, that's a totally different experience. I could never go through that.
Yeah, well, see, I guess where this is coming from for me is it comes back a little bit to like, is it death to the author or not? If you say Cortázar's not here, it's just what we're reading, then I'd say no, he's not crazy, because that doesn't serve the purpose of the story. But if you see it as an exercise where like the author's working through some stuff, I think it's almost kind of like self-deprecating in a funny way. Like, yeah, this is kind of insane, like this is a little crazy, but in a fun way, because there were some humorous moments throughout. Like right at the beginning, before he goes to the dictionary, when he's like, I knew they were Mexican by their name, their Aztec faces, and the placard above the tank. I'm like, yeah, good job.
Yeah, you could have probably first read the placard, and then you would have been fine.
Yeah, there was all these little like gems where he's really self-reflexive, which is like, I wonder if it's like, if you look at it from like, why is the author writing this? Is he sort of being like, being alive kind of is scary sometimes, and you can feel alone, and I'm just kind of working through it in this kind of silly way, which I guess really sort of like tickles me. It's like, I want to be that cool. I want to write stories where I work through demons.
And maybe that's the point of the story, is finding, your own personal sense of humanity, like as I'm reading the story and as you're talking, I'm thinking, my gosh, if my second novel ever gets published, what are people going to think of me? They're all going to be ready to just lock my butt up. And it's not that I'm nuts, although I probably am. But I think, like, when I read this story, remember how I said it felt like I had the same feeling I would feel if I was sitting in front of a surrealist painting.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's just a very different mindset. It's an artist mindset. And I feel like this story wasn't so much written as it was painted with words. And so as I read it, I see a really artistic mind that sees the world in a different way. And I personally don't define that as crazy. I define that as artistic. Now, that said, I come from a family that is full of crazy artistic people. So, take my opinion with a grain of salt.
Yeah. Well, I think we can agree that Cortázar was definitely not crazy. I'm not saying he's crazy. Just, he's kind of like working through things we all talk about in a way that's really fresh and artistic. It is art.
Yeah. I think I want to make an observation, I guess, too. It was something I was thinking about. This is the second time you, Maya, had mentioned surrealist paintings, and when I think of painting surrealism, I think of René Magritte, for example, who's this Belgian surrealist. He's one of my favorites, and him, along with a lot of surrealist paintings from that era, when they would paint, it was very, very specific. Their lines were very conscious. They didn't really do a whole lot of. There was really no impressionism, so to speak. There was no muddied colors. It was very, very definite, very specific, very defined, and in a way that mirrors, I think, the very specific wording and the very specific, I'll use the term language here, but I mean language is in construction, not necessarily spoken language, but the construction of the words is very specific, very defined, almost scientific in a way. And it makes me think of if that is, in fact, a tenet of surrealism in general, being very specific, being very defined, because in a way that tells people that you know exactly what it is you're trying to convey, which in a way seems to almost go against the strangeness of surrealism. You know what I'm saying? So like if you're a surrealist painter, you're trying to define things that are very crazy and weird, but you have to be very specific and definite in order to do that. And there's a concept called the uncanny valley, which is the idea that if you think of an XY grid, an XY, I'm getting all like graph, and this will be great audio for a podcast. If you think of an XY a table or a graph, the closer something gets to looking human, the more empathy we have for it. And until a point, it gets to a point where it's almost human but not quite, and it becomes strange and crazy, and that's when empathy completely drops out, and that's called the uncanny valley, when you have this dip and then it comes back up. The idea that some of the examples people often use are like a Star Wars R2-D2 character. It looks not human at all, but it has enough human characteristics that you can
cute.
Yeah, that you can like figure it out. A lot of Disney characters are the same way. They're not human at all, but they have sort of they look at. And the one that people always point to as sort of that's too creepy are like sex dolls. Like when sex dolls get like really like lifelike, but they're not. You look at them, you're like, that's weird looking. That's the uncanny valley where people are a little bit standoffish. And I think in that uncanny valley, a lot of times is where surrealism exists, because it lets you know that you're human, but you're definitely not that. It's separating you on purpose. So I don't know. That was just an observation I wanted to make, because it felt really.
Yeah, I think you're really
onto
something, Caleb.
Yeah.
I think you're really onto something, because if he had written in a really impressionistic way, using lots of emotional language that maybe wasn't as exacting, I think the story would have lost like so much of its punch, because the actual topic of the story was already so on the edge. It just would have been too much, and we wouldn't have been able to get into it and really get the feeling of all the emotions, because we would have just shut ourselves off from it. I think that is a really, really great observation.
Oh, thanks. I'm going to have to think more on that one, because,
Yeah.
Because you're right. When you look at those paintings, like the colors and the lines, they're so just exact, and the content is all over the place necessarily.
Yeah, I was just gonna say I would have gone with Madame Tussauds Wax Museum, but I like that you chose sex dolls. That was a good choice.
The first time I've ever
We gotta earn our rating. I already gave the warning up front, and then we're all clean, you know.
That's true. I'm trying.
Dang
I'm
it!
No, it's good.
Stop trying so hard. So does anyone else have any thoughts about this story? How do you feel about the character?
About the story.
I know we haven't really been talking about character very much, and this really, it doesn't go deep into his character, but it is all about his character. So how do you guys feel about him?
I liked him for his neuroses. I like neurotic characters. He's definitely neurotic.
Yeah. I feel like he could have been the character. What we know about the character is something that could have been from a physical perspective anyway, probably could have been anybody or anyone.
Yeah.
So I feel like the focus of the story, by proxy of the character, was though on the event that happened. So there wasn't as much of a character focus. I don't think, because we didn't really understand his past, nor should we have understood his past. And I think having that sort of context would have made the character a little bit more important. But those, the neuroses and things like that actually give insight into what we do know of the character, I think are very important to the story for sure.
Yeah, I found it interesting because usually we talk about like plot-driven stories and character-driven stories. This story really didn't feel driven by anything in particular. So when I sat back and I thought, who is the character in this story? I felt kind of like the character of the story was we. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't like a particular man or even the Axolotl. It was humans as like a group. And I think his use of the word we, definitely tapped into that, and how universal the feelings of loneliness and being trapped felt. I felt like the actual character of the story wasn't necessarily the man involved.
Mm-hmm. I sort of meet you halfway there. So I agree that he kind of like stands in for a lot of things that we as humans collectively think about or share, but I think it is character driven. It's taking something that a lot of people can identify with and hyper focusing on that. It doesn't matter who he is or what he does, all that matters is that part that we can identify with that keeps bringing him back to the museum over and over. It keeps him sort of neurotically thinking about these sort of things, about sort of loneliness, and I mean he goes into about how they have a terrifying purity, and he goes all out on this, and and that's what ultimately brings us to the metamorphosis. So I would say it's character driven, but it's a little odd because it's not specifying a specific person. It's almost like it's drawing out a specific part of the human condition that we can identify with.
Yeah,
but it's still character driven. Yeah, for me.
Yeah. You were so much. That was much better spoken than I could have done. I totally feel you. So are we ready to rate this thing?
Yeah, I just wanted to have a quick question. So we can say that this guy's spirit animal is the axolotl. I just want to be like, give me a spirit animal.
Yeah. The axolotl's got his head.
Yeah, and what's yours? It's just like kind of curious. Like this guy.
What's my spirit animal?
Puts all this stuff on the axolotl. Yeah.
My spirit animal has always been a wolf, and no idea why. I think it's just because I tried to run away and join the wolves when I was a little wolf. I feel like I see everything, but I form very few attachments, and I feel like I am that lone wolf that's getting ready to be eaten. I was kicked out of my pride. So I'm roaming the backcountry, search of food. I'm all mangy from getting beaten up by life.
Wow, I think you need to write a story about staring into a wolf cage or something like that and really transpose it.
But then Anais will really think I'm nuts and she'll run away from the podcast, and then where will we be?
No, we've already established that Cortázar is not crazy, so we can't really say you are either now.
Okay, I get a pass.
Yeah.
But only on animal metamorphosis stories.
That's right. Anything else and you're crazy.
I want to know what Caleb is. What's your animal?
I'll be honest with you. I've never ever actually thought about it, and I know it's sort of a common kind of question. I've actually never thought about it. So on top of my head, I would probably have to say just like a lazy house cat, because that sounds awesome.
That's a great idea. Yeah. No, 'cause
you know what? Don't hate me. I kind of, when I asked you, I kind of thought like those cute little house pigs? Because they're like, yeah, because they're cuddly, but they're kind of lazy, and they get pampered all the time.
That sounds great. Yeah. That sounds great.
But then, they aren't really attached to you. They just really love the food you give them.
Yep.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. All of that sounds fantastic. Although all of those qualities also fit into the house cat I mentioned, so I don't know why I had to
I
be
know,
a pig.
it's like so funny. Like house cat, and I was thinking potbelly pig. I'm thinking, well, that is a much nicer way of saying the same thing.
We should unpack this so that she keeps back to the
Yeah.
You know what? The hole just gets deeper. Like I said, I'm mangy from getting kicked out of the pride. There's a reason. Okay, Addie, what is your spirit animal?
Well, like I said, I'm all about the lazy. I figured out my spirit animal when I was a teenager. Definitely the manatee. That is an animal that has life figured out. Does nothing, floats. You don't even have to. He doesn't have to support himself.
But you're so busy. How can you be a manatee?
That's pretty nice.
You're the busiest person I know.
Exactly. So I'm exhausted
That's
by
awesome.
life. So I'm just like, thank you, manatee. They just float. They don't have predators. They eat plants that just like grow all around them. And on top of that, they're confused with mermaids. People think they're sexy mermaids. I'm like, that's just icing on the cake.
Mm-hmm. That's nice. Maybe manatees are out fighting crime at night and we don't even know about it. So they're still doing a lot, you know?
Not my spirit animal.
Man, now I'm going to have to reduce all my cat claims. I don't sound like a hyena.
Well, hyena, I think it should be your spirit animal. And forget the wolf.
Thank you. Now we're even, right?
Yeah. I don't know. I think I still got a few more jabs before we're even.
Very interesting thing that you called me a hyena because female hyenas, they have like pseudo penises.
That sounds like an awesome band name.
Yeah!
Well, the pseudo penises.
And as a bisexual woman, I'm like, hey, that kind of fits. A bisexual woman that laughs a lot. Okay, I'm a hyena.
The hyena pseudo penises. Oh.
That does sound like a band name. They play punk rock.
I'd watch them. I mean, just for the name alone.
Okay, now that we've totally lost it, our poor listeners. Who's gonna rate first?
I can go first. 5 out of 6. Solid story. Yeah, 5. Liked it, but yeah, I didn't write home about it, so 5.
You only dedicated an hour-long podcast to it, which is more writing than most people, I think, would do for the homes.
I'm 5 out of 6 as well. I loved it, and I enjoyed it. You know what? No, I'm gonna give it 5.5 because it made me do a lot of thinking.
I'm gonna go with 5 out of 6 as well. You know, I would say that if it were a 6, it would have to be a little bit more accessible, I think, for me to give it a 6. Not that I want a story to be accessible, but usually when I say something's a 6 or a really high level, it means that there's going to be some people out there that can really grab onto it and like it. And I think there's going to be quite a few people that just aren't probably into it. So for that unfair reason, I'm going to give it 5 out of 6 rather than 6 out of 6.
Yeah, this is one of those stories that I'm gonna go back to and like dissect it sentence by sentence because the way the sentences are constructed are just, I admire it so much, and I would love to learn how to do that. And so, yeah, gotta give props for all that. That was some serious artwork.
Last week's Bradberries. Last week we discussed What We're Made Of by Brandy Reisenweber, and listeners gave it a 5.5.
I'm so glad the listeners liked it because we really didn't. And we were kind of harsh. And I'm really glad the listeners liked it. That makes me feel better.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think we should get ready to do the game.
Mm-hmm. What stories
Caleb?
are you guys playing for?
All right, I am going to go for The Blue Bouquet by Octavio Paz. Very short story. It's also a magical realism story, so I don't know if you guys will. Maybe too many of those. I don't know.
I'm going to go with The Mask of the Red Death by Edgar Allan Poe. Couldn't be more opposite.
Okay.
So let's do this.
Yep. The game that we're playing is a nod to the Important Question podcast.
Ooh.
So I went back and looked at some of the podcast questions, and decide I'm going to answer them myself, well, you're going to guess what I answered on them. That's what we're going to do.
Oh, this is awesome!
This is good. This is good.
This is good. This is good.
Who wants
And
to go
Ace is
first?
brilliant.
I'll let Maya go first, just because I want as much insight into.
No,
this
you
as
go
possible.
first because you're a guest.
No, it's not fair. No. You see, you've known her way longer than I have, so I think you probably have some insight into what her answers will be. I need to absorb more of this, so I.
Okay, hit me, Ace.
Would I rather be uglier or dumber?
Uglier.
Yep. One for Maya. Caleb, this is probably the toughest question.
Oh, good.
Yeah. Would I rather
That's
be
what
a
happened. Ask in
dictator?
a second.
Yeah, dictator or elected president?
Oh man. I you know what? A guess is a guess is a guess. I'm gonna say an elected president.
No.
No.
Dictator. Have you seen the before and after pictures of presidents? No, thank you.
I didn't think I knew you that well, but now I'm thinking maybe I do.
Dictator.
Man.
You don't have to violate human rights as a dictator. I could be like a
That's
benevolent
true.
one.
That's
a
true.
benevolent dictator.
Yeah,
But part of the
the
build up to that question would be, how did you become a dictator in the first place? Chances are.
That's technicalities.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
Okay. Now we're going to the would you questions. This is, you can argue me to say yes to anything. This is knee-jerk reaction and Ace right now. Caleb.
Okay.
No, Maya. Would I eat another human being? Or would I try human flesh
No.
for fun? No, I wouldn't. She does know me. Caleb. Would I abandon Earth to live on Mars?
No.
No, I wouldn't. That sounds horrible.
It does.
Maya.
I thought you
Would I take that-
See, I don't know you.
Would I take candy from a baby?
No.
Hell yeah, I would. Of course I would.
But
Who's
it's
not gonna
all
remember?
sticky and slobbery and covered in baby goo.
No, listen, I read this thing that babies don't remember anything, they just remember the emotions and how they feel. So I'll thank him. I'll be like, thanks for this candy, baby. So he feels like he's this generous, benevolent creature, and I got the candy.
Nice.
That's how you get away with being a dictator.
That's
It's
what I'll
coming-
do. I'll be like,
all coming
thank you
together.
for
It's all like coming
making
together
babies."
now. You give the populace
Maya
just
won.
enough that they think, oh, yay.
Okay. Maya, you won. We're gonna read your story because you knew that I would not eat another human being. That's good. I feel good about that.
You feel good about that one?
Yeah. So
I've
what's the
always
story
wondered
again?
if we really do taste like bacon.
Well, now I'm definitely gonna eat human flesh. I don't know why do you gotta plant
Yeah.
that seed? I was on the fence before.
Well, like I said, you can argue me into anything. You just did it. You just
Yeah,
argued me
that's all you
into
do.
eating human flesh.
So next week we will be reading The Mask of the Red Death by Edgar Allan Poe.
Okay. For show notes and to join the discussion, visit literaryroadhouse.com. Let us know what you thought of this week's story. Was the author crazy? Not the author, the narrator. Was he crazy? I don't know. You tell me. Don't forget to leave an iTunes review. Come back next week. Until then, read a good story.
The way you read that outro, you're like, okay,